Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special program. We are honored to have such a special guest. She had a great mark in the international world of politics for over 10 years. A great leader who established women's place in the world. It's my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Margaret Thatcher.
Good evening.
I would like to welcome you to Kuwait Television. Mrs. Thatcher, on the 2nd of August, the sad Thursday, the invasion of Kuwait, when and how did you hear of the invasion, and what was your immediate reaction?
I heard about it in the United States. I had just traveled to a great conference at Aspen, Colorado, which President Bush was going to open and which I was to give the closing address. So it was rather a great occasion, and I had prepared for it very carefully. I had just arrived late that evening in Aspen, and because it had been a long journey, I had gone to bed when at 1 o'clock in the morning the telephone rang to say that Saddam Hussein had crossed over the border into Kuwait, while they were still negotiating terms and differences between them and the Kuwaiti people. I cannot quite describe one's reaction. The moment it had happened, one was perhaps not surprised, because after all, Saddam Hussein had put his people to war with Iran for over 8 years. One would have thought that that could have held him back from another such experience. Or one could have taken the opposite interpretation, that a person who, during the period of his dictatorship, has spent most of it in war, would probably continue that way. Nevertheless, it was a very wrong action, and I knew that we couldn't sit back and do nothing. We already had some ships in the Gulf. What is called the British Armilla Patrol has been there since 1980, was reinforced at the time of the Iran-Iraq War, and we knew then, the moment I heard, that we would have to reinforce it again, and already had asked some ships which were coming back to Britain from the Far East to make instead for the Gulf. I had already arranged to see President Bush early the following morning, and we had done as much as we could that night, and therefore we prepared quickly for the morrow's meeting. And early before breakfast, I held a meeting with advisors and said quite clearly, this cannot stand. We cannot let this man take someone else's territory by force. He must be stopped, and it must be reversed. There were two reasons. Firstly, it was morally wrong to take it by force. Second, that if not stopped very quickly, he would go on to take other countries by force too. We have learned in Britain that unless you stop a dictator, he will go on taking more and more military action by force. So I had no doubt from the very first moment he had to be stopped, and we had to act quickly. And the following morning I saw President Bush, who had flown down from Washington to the conference, and we had long talks together and decided on the action that we would take. First through the United Nations, which had already been active, and that if Saddam Hussein did not, in fact, withdraw voluntarily, we ourselves would have to take further action. It was a strange accident of fate that we were together at that time. And I think it probably led to very quick, very decisive action, because the United States is the lead country in the world. But however powerful, however great you are, you have need of staunch and true friends. And the greatest alliance for liberty the world has ever seen has been the United States and Great Britain.
Mrs. Thatcher, I believe the liberation of Kuwait started after your meeting in Aspen, in Colorado, in USA, with the President George Bush. Can you give us a brief or some detail of this meeting?
We were both of us, very clear on what must be done. And it was a time when you didn't have to falter. There was a clear issue of principle, and also there was a clear risk of his going further. His great ambition, for which he had built up enormous armed forces, was to dominate the whole of the Arab world. Dominate it. That could not come about. We had to stop it. And after I had heard President Bush speak, which he did, made an excellent speech at the Aspen conference, I myself, on the Sunday, wound up the conference with another speech and spoke then quite clearly about the terrible action of Iraq against Kuwait, and said that Saddam Hussein must be stopped. And then I flew immediately to Washington. The United Nations was sitting on another resolution because Saddam Hussein had not withdrawn, and it was then that we decided that we had to send forces immediately to the Gulf if King Fahd requested it, because he was the host country who would have to receive those forces. and Mr. Cheney had gone to see King Fahd. I was with President Bush, the request came through, and so we were in a position to act quickly, and we did.
During the invasion, the Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Jabir Al-Ahmed Al-Sabah, visited Great Britain. Can you please give us a brief account of your meeting with him?
I later met with the Emir of Kuwait in New York when I was at the United Nations. He was immensely grateful for the action we were taking. Of course, it always turns out to be bigger than you expect. I knew right from the beginning that you could never retake territory by air action alone. However important air action is, and it is vital, and so is naval cover, that is vital. You could never retake territory without armed forces on the ground. So I knew that we would have to send tanks. I knew that it would take a time. I knew that it would take a time to build up. The Emir of Kuwait was greatly distressed for his people and told me some of the terrible things that were going on. He was extremely distressed for what was happening in Kuwait and told us of the brutalities that were occurring. I was greatly distressed too, because I know these things always take longer than you expect. And I know that every day the people there were just hoping and longing for the combined forces to go in and liberate them. It's easier to get planes and pilots there. You've also got to get all munitions, all backup maintenance, both spares and people to maintain the aircraft. You've also got to get all your tanks. That is a slow journey, has to be done by taking up ships. You also have to get the tank transporters in case the tanks are damaged, and again all the backup spares and the maintenance staff, all the field hospitals, all the catering staff. It was an enormous operation, and I knew when I saw the Emir that those poor people who'd already suffered daily so much, and they were trying very much to be helpful to those who they knew would liberate them, that they would have quite a time to wait. They were very, very courageous. What the Iraqis did were the actions of a vicious, brutal, barbaric dictator with no thought for humankind or for mankind at all. And it made us even more determined that he should never, never succeed. And also, in answering questions in the House of Commons, I was still Prime Minister, as you know, both I and Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd were making it quite clear that in our view, and we took it to the United Nations later, people who perpetrated those brutal cruelties should in fact be brought to international trial, just as happened after the Second World War. I believe that warning was right, and I think it is wrong that action has not so far been taken to bring them to trial.
What do you think about Saddam Hussein in power nowadays?
It had been my hope and expectation that the question and position of Saddam Hussein would have been dealt with in the ceasefire agreement, that we should not have had a ceasefire agreement unless, as a condition of it, Saddam Hussein had been handed over by the Iraqi people for international trial, and also that others who had perpetrated brutalities should also have been handed over, and also that we should have made it quite clear that his own people, all of them, must have full human rights, and they must not be subjected to any of the terrible brutalities that we have also seen with the Kurds and with the Shiites. I think that it would have been possible to have got that as a condition of the ceasefire had it been arranged between the coalition forces and the Iraqis, because I think the Iraqis would have had no alternative. But it was decided, I think that our American friends wished to go to United Nations to have the ceasefire. And the moment we went there, it became much more difficult to secure that condition of handing over Saddam Hussein as a condition of the ceasefire. There were letters to the Times in this country by eminent lawyers who also took the view, which I took, that Saddam Hussein should have been handed over. And that, of course, would have made it quite clear that, and would have set the people of Iraq totally against him, because they would not have had a ceasefire without that.
Of course, you know that there is a great concern in Kuwait about the Kuwaiti still detained in Iraq. What should the international community do to return our people, our brother, our friends back home?
Again, constantly get onto Iraq and make it clear that they are not observing the rules of war. Even in wartime, there are certain fundamental human rights that must be observed. Iraq observes no human rights. She is a brutal regime. We must make it quite clear that until each and every one of those people are returned, there will not be any lifting of sanctions, and we shall monitor every single thing that goes on. There are other things going wrong too. They are trying to get out of some of the other conditions of a ceasefire, and we must be absolutely resolute. The terms of that ceasefire must be observed, each and every one, before any sanctions are lifted. And we must not go soft on this. Sanctions can be lifted if Saddam Hussein and his government behave properly. And if they are not, it is his fault. And the people of Iraq must know that.
What is your opinion of the oil fields destruction?
That was sheer viciousness. He knew that he was going to be beaten, so like a vicious, brutal, barbaric person from the Dark Ages, he viciously thought, I'll do as much damage as I can. That should again be another warning of the terrible, awful nature of this subhuman person that we are dealing with.
What about the Iraqi nuclear, biological and chemical capabilities?
Yes, I'm very well aware of that. And every single piece of it must be destroyed and be seen to be destroyed in accordance with the resolution. He will try to wriggle. We must not be taken in, ever.
What about the trust? Nobody trusts him. He's a
Of
liar.
course not.
How they trust
Never
him?
trust a dictator who's tried to take someone else's territory by force, nor should his own people trust him. I'm very sorry for some of the Iraqi people. He's made them go to war for the greater part of his dictatorship and lost them many of their sons and has gained nothing.
If Saddam Hussein, he is a liar. I believe that he is a liar. How the international world trust him in the nuclear weapons?
He's a brutal creature.
Okay, how the international community trust him in future about the
We are
weapons?
not trusting him. We shall never trust him.
What we will do?
We require proof of every single thing, every single condition laid down in the ceasefire. Proof. And let the people know that we shall not weaken.
I think, Mrs. Thatcher, this question leads to another important subject, and that is, how do you achieve long-term peace in the Gulf and ensure safety, security of Kuwait and the GCC countries?
First, those of us who've learned the bitter lesson that we needed to keep our defenses strong in order to deal with the unexpected action of the dictator, must still keep our defenses strong. Strong enough to go anywhere in the world to do against a dictator what was done against Saddam Hussein. That is the lesson number one. Sufficient strength in your army, your air force, your naval forces, sufficient advances, sufficient superiority in technology. That also is very important. So each of us has to do that. As you know, we are trying to make arrangements for regional defense. The thing we have learned is it's easier to get people there than it is equipment. So at the invitation of the Gulf states, it is likely that we shall have to leave a considerable amount of equipment there. So if need be, it could be brought into action faster in the future. Then some of the real troubles in the area we must continue to try to resolve. I say continue because I remember very well indeed that the former Secretary of State, George Shultz, under President Reagan, was making strenuous efforts, particularly in his last year of office, to resolve the Arab-Palestinian problem and was beginning to make some progress. Jim Baker took up that task very vigorously, and he won't give it up because the Arab-Palestinian problem will have to be resolved by direct talks. The international community wants it to be resolved, and that is the purpose of an international conference, not to do the negotiations, but to make it quite clear that the international community thinks it time that the very difficult problems that remain must now be sorted out by lengthy, protracted, persistent negotiation. This territory, east of Suez, is the most fought over territory in the world. It is the land of three great religions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Many, many different sects of each of those religions. There are enormous sensitivities, enormous hostilities, hatreds. But all of those people have learned one thing from the Gulf War, namely, boundaries are no respecters of missiles, that missiles can go across them. And I must say this, I think Israel showed enormous restraint when she had scuds put on her people, Tel Aviv, night after night, not knowing whether they were going to be chemical. And yet her government had to say, no, we will not retaliate. The United States and the Arab and other coalition forces are doing everything that can be done. But everyone knows missiles can come over borders. So in the end, the only security will be for each nation to negotiate its differences. Everyone will have to give something. No one will get everything they want. But it's in everyone's interest that some negotiated agreement should be reached and should be upheld. It will have to be backed up by considerable armed forces in case anyone tries to have a breach of the ceasefire. Not necessarily enough for United Nations forces to be in there. United Nations forces have been in Lebanon for a long time through bitter fighting. United Nations are peacekeeping, they can't always keep it. United Nations have been in Cyprus for a very long time. United Nations are not able to stop the fighting. That action has to be taken by separate nations like the United States, ourselves, France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others.
Is this related to the New World Order?
People talk about a new world order. I think it is a new realization that modern weaponry makes it more difficult for, particularly for small nations, to defend their own borders. And this is what brings about the need for a negotiated settlement. This is the new approach. But the New World Order is not only negotiated settlements. The New World Order consists of getting democratic values spread more widely. Because usually in democracy, people are so busy trying to raise their standard of living, give a better chance to their families than they had, that they have no time for war, but they do believe in defending their liberties and their way of life. So it is the strong defense and the increasing liberty under a rule of law and the increasing taking part in the government of their country.
You mean life, you know, to improve the life that's according to the justice, according to the freedom, human rights?
Liberty can only last if there's a strong rule of law and if justice reigns in each country. Justice is very important. It's not the diktat of a dictator with a puppet as a judge. It is judges who are independent-minded, who serve the majesty and the fairness and equity of the law, and see that where there is a dispute between people, that it is resolved honorably, according to the best standards and best values, and not according to the strength or weakness of the two protagonists.
After the liberation of Kuwait, we would like to know more about your meeting with the Prime Minister Sheikh Saad Sabah, the Prime Minister of Kuwait, during his last visit last June 91 to UK.
We were very pleased to see the Prime Minister and Crown Prince be here. I have met him many times, and we've had a very good relationship with Kuwait, and I had been to Kuwait twice, and I knew what it was like before the invasion. We were horrified at the extent of the damage, the viciousness of it, and their total lack of thought for the people, not only of Kuwait, but for the whole area, as they tried to do the maximum damage to the atmosphere and to the seas through what they did to the oil wells and the oil slicks they let down. Again, another example of the kind of man you're dealing with, a monster almost, who would take those actions. And I was very anxious to see the Crown Prince, to see whether they were at last getting the services going, because the people have suffered so much. It's extremely important to get the services going, and most important of all, to take every action with all possible speed to get the fires out. And we agreed that whatever the cost of getting the fires out, it's cheap at the price, because it will enable the people to have a better atmosphere, enable the wells to be got going again, and enable the whole normal life to be restored. There's also one other thing. All of that damage was caused by Saddam Hussein, every single bit. A person who has deliberately and willfully caused that damage has to pay to put it right. And we mustn't go weak or wobbly about that either. There's a fundamental legal principle at stake. People who have maliciously caused damage must pay to put it right. And it's no good pleading, well, we have damage in Iraq too. That damage in Iraq was caused by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. So whatever his difficulties at home, he has to pay to have things put right in Kuwait, and we must keep him to that as well. I am most anxious that the people, having suffered so much, they should gradually see their country restored and begin to feel secure. They obviously will be very suspicious of some of the people who collaborated with the Iraqis. They'll have enough problems to deal with without worrying about who is going to pay for setting fire to those wells and deliberately taking away every piece of equipment from the homes and the hotels. Again, just to make certain that no dictator does this again. We must hold to what we said in those United Nations resolutions. I believe he should be tried. He must pay for everything he's done in Kuwait and for the terrible things he's done to the lives of the people, and every Kuwaiti must be returned home.
Now, after 1 year of the Iraqi invasion, what is the lesson the world should learn from the Gulf crisis?
I have indicated two of them already. Keep your defenses strong. There have been dictators born in the world since time began. There will be more in the future. And we must so treat Saddam Hussein that every future dictator knows he cannot win, that he will be shamed in the eyes of the world, and that he must be made to pay for the damage he has incurred. So it's strong defense. Second, everyone standing together so that the whole United Nations, though the United Nations doesn't do the fighting, it's separate nations that do the fighting. You get a moral authority from the United Nations that this is the right thing to do. And so therefore the 5 permanent members of the Security Council must stick together and make that quite clear. We must also, I think, begin to look a little bit further, and indeed I think we owe it to the people in countries like Iraq, that where a country, and Iraq is a case in point, had in fact signed the United Nations Charter of Human Rights, we must try, where a country has flouted it as much as Iraq has flouted it, where it's tried to send people across the borders of other nations, drive them out, and therefore upset the stability of the whole region. We must, I think, have the right to inquire into how those countries are in fact honouring or not the Charter of Human Rights and take some action on that. Otherwise, people who are being treated that way have very little hope. There is an analogy. You remember the Helsinki Agreement signed in 1975 between the Western countries, the United States, the NATO countries, and the countries, all the countries of Europe, and the East European countries and the Soviet Union. That was partly to agree to have defense at a lower level of weaponry, but to keep a balance. And also we signed agreements about human rights. That gave us in the West some standing to make inquiries about how the Soviet Union was honoring that agreement. For years it didn't. We never let go. Every time we met them, we inquired. Every time we heard of bad cases, we took them up. Our own people demonstrated so that their relatives or their friends could try to get out of the Soviet Union. That agreement gave us standing to inquire. I'm suggesting that by analogy, where countries have in fact signed the Charter of Human Rights, that also should give us some standing to inquire into matters internally in another country.
I'll have something, Mrs. Thatcher. This is Kuwaiti.
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
Isn't that charming? This is lovely.
Your name of the Margaret Thatcher is well respected in every home in Kuwait and is in the heart of every Kuwaiti.
Thank you, Thacher.
This is,
yes, isn't that lovely?
I
Thank you,
took this
Thacher.
of my camera. I took this all
Isn't
photos.
that
Yes.
lovely?
Do you plan to come to Kuwait? Or?
I hope to come to Kuwait. I shall look forward to it very much. In the meantime, I inquire regularly how many oil fields have we got out this week, how many fires have we got out, and I shall hope to come. I also had a special reason because the daughter of one of my constituents was on one of those planes which was held in Kuwait. She was going through Kuwait on a plane and she was held. And we managed, after hostilities, to track her down. She had been looked after by someone in Kuwait and she came home. And so that was a particular joy, but we have occasion to know the kindness of the Kuwaiti people to others who were trapped in Kuwait through no fault of their own. So I have reason to know how kind the Kuwaiti people were to others in spite of their own suffering, and also how courageous they were.
I want to mention something, that the relation between Kuwaiti and the people in Great Britain is now more than 100 years. The good relation, strong
Of
relation.
course, yes. I look back into history, and it has been. If I might put it this way, as I put it to so many of our Arab friends in some of the Gulf states, some of the smaller ones, we were friends long before we knew they had so much oil. That's a much stronger friendship than one which comes later, when trading gets more to do with oil and other things. We were friends long before that.
Forever together.
Yes.
Mrs. Thatcher, on the behalf of all Kuwaitis, we would like to thank you very much for this special interview for the Kuwait television, and all people in Free Kuwait are looking forward to meeting you in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It has been my privilege, and I send my heartfelt good wishes to each and every Kuwaiti family, and shall hope to be able to say it in person one day.
Thank you.
I look back into history, and it has been. If I might put it this way, as I put it to so many of our Arab friends in some of the Gulf states, some of the smaller ones, we were friends long before we knew they had so much oil. That's a much stronger friendship than one which comes later, when trading gets more to do with oil and other things. We were friends long before that.